Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are here with Linda Major, the former director of the Center for Civic Engagement and assistant to the vice chancellor for student affairs at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. This interview returned us to the early 1990s when RHI worked with Linda on the implementation of responsible beverage service training for owners and managers and the formation of the Lincoln Responsible Hospitality Council.
Well, hello, Linda. It's been so long and it's great to see you.
It's been a long time. It's good to see you too.
Yeah. Well, as I told you, we're going to approach 40 years next year. So we're going back to some of the early work that RHI did and some of the projects that we had. And clearly working in Lincoln, Nebraska in the early 1990s was really an important foundation for the evolution of our organization. And you as an individual certainly brought so many great insights to that work. But can you describe what were the circumstances that led you to come to RHI and bring us to Lincoln?
Well, you're really pushing my memory, Jim, because it feels like we almost have this 40-year history. But if I remember accurately, the state of Nebraska had recently been forced to change the way they were distributing licenses and liquor licenses in the state of Nebraska. There was a successful lawsuit brought by a grocer that was going to really dramatically change the landscape. And I, at the time, was working for a local prevention agency and working with the city council on what might be some strategies we might employ to sort of manage this change in the retail environment. And started doing the research, reading research, found Jim McKnight, found that little piece of research that Jim McKnight had that led us to believe that servers were they were more likely to implement what they learn in education, because at that time server education was a popular strategy, but they were only likely to implement what they learned if there was management policy that supported the practice. And that led us to look for who was providing management education. And I believe at the time, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Lincoln was one of the very first places in the United States that passed an ordinance that said managers had to be trained rather than servers. So our mandate started with the management level. And it was through that connection with you that we then also expanded new strategies to include the creation of the Responsible Hospitality Council. And it really brought multiple entities together. And I think those two pieces were really foundational to the work that eventually became a part of our ongoing prevention and intervention activities in Lincoln.
Now, you are obviously a very well-known college community, and your football games, I remember, the stadium became the third largest city in the state. And there was a lot of issues and challenges that you had to deal with because of that circumstance. And so can you kind of speak to a college town with a large football experience and how that creates an impact, and what relationship to the bars and clubs have to the safety of the community because of those circumstances?
Well, it's been interesting to watch, Jim, because over the years, I think it's changed. But when we began this work, what we recognized is that the hospitality industry in the downtown area did about, if I remember correctly, 40% of their annual revenue was generated on 7 home football game Saturdays, which made those Saturdays absolutely critical. And it worked out really well in the early days, pre-TV, when you were shifting the start time of the game all over the day and night, because 1:30 kickoff worked really well. People came in early, they could have something to eat, something to drink, go to the game, and still get back home. But as you started to shift that, I think you started to see a change in how people interacted with one another, especially in the bars and restaurants adjacent to the campus. So it was really important to the hospitality businesses. One of the things with RHI, I think that RHI brought to our community that I thought was really critical was the value of a data-driven response. And so we really started to pay more attention to where things were happening, doing on-site observations. We started to do bar walks on Saturday mornings. We started to walk parking lots pre and post the game to get a better handle on exactly what was happening. As you know, Jim, sometimes we ask lawmakers to pass policy based on what we're telling them rather than on their firsthand observation. And so by introducing them into those environments that they were less likely to go to, they became informed collaborators on good policy that helped manage the larger alcohol environment on game day. What we've seen over the years, and I don't know how this compares to other campuses, and I think as you introduce more alcohol into stadiums, into arenas, it changes again. We have seen people move out of the bars and restaurants and into the parking lots, and then into the stadium, and then maybe into the bars and restaurants after the game. So the game day experience, especially at a place like the University of Nebraska, is central to the state's identity. The football team is, as you know, Jim, having been to a University of Nebraska game, is a big deal on the 7 or 8 home football game Saturdays.
Now, one of the innovations, I know it had been done previously, but you really, I think, evolved the concept of the last drink data collection as a tool. And it was something that, when you look at it now, in fact, the National Liquor Law Enforcement Association has a website dedicated to the last drink program and how to set it up, and it shares information about jurisdictions that have it. But you were really one of the pioneers in putting that together. And in some ways, because of your management training program, and because you engaged your elected officials with the late night tours, you were able to document more specifically place of last drink. And particularly as a college community, you have house parties and fraternity parties and other places where people consume alcohol, like you said, the tailgate parties. And you were able to distinguish that not all the venues were problematic, and there were some that were contributing more, relatively speaking, to others, but you wouldn't have known that. And so policies, like you said, may have been built around an impression rather than data, and that impression may impact the viability of responsible businesses because of the extra burden. So explain how the last drink program worked and how you used it in your research. And I know later on you had a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation program where the engagement of the businesses in this approach really made a difference.
Well, I think the first person that introduced me to last drink data collection was Freed Whitman. I think maybe Freed might have been written about it, and I was real curious about it. And we were ideally positioned because we had a detoxification center, which was relatively unique. We had established it, I think, maybe sometime in the 70s, and decriminalizing intoxication. And so people who were of concern to themselves or others, law enforcement could transport to the detox center for up to 24 hours. So we had the location, we had the point of contact. It was integrating the questions into the intake process that really produced the data that we found so rich. And Jim, I always remember this, and I've told people, and I always assign it to you. You once said to me, do you swap mosquitoes one at a time, or do you go to the swamp where they breed? And that's kind of what last drink data did for us. It told us what were the locations that were breeding the most mosquitoes. And then we targeted both soft interventions and hard interventions. Our strategy was to make management aware of what was going on using the data, letting them do with it what they want, giving them ideas, strategies, skills they might adopt to help reduce the problem. And if that didn't work, I always said that's what law enforcement was for. So our early adopters took the information, ran with the information, figured out what was going wrong, and made a shift. Those that were laggers or who were wanted to keep doing business the way we were doing, which was costing the community, we used our law enforcement tools. We did the same thing in the neighborhoods because, as you said, not everybody was consuming the most in the bars and restaurants. It was happening in the neighborhoods, and it wasn't in all of the neighborhoods. So we could, again, target our resources effectively. In fact, we used the data to establish wild party patrols, and then let everybody know what was going on. If you'll remember, we used to have press conferences at the start of the year that announced the party patrol, announced what the rules of the road were, and then employed law enforcement, and then had follow-up press conferences that talked about the outcomes. So we tried to manage both environments. The data was also helpful in looking at landlords that had problem properties. So we used it in both the commercial and the formal and the informal social settings. You alluded to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The University of Nebraska was invited to be a part of the first cohort, or apply to be a part of the first cohort of a matter of degree programs, and we were accepted. I think we were relatively unique for two things that we were doing. We were mapping our law enforcement contacts, so we had good data there, and then obviously our last drink data kind of set us apart, and we were able to share all that information with our peers in the cohort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remember another aspect of it was you actually had people on the Responsible Hospitality Council that represented the industry, which in many communities during that period, prevention people didn't see any opportunity to work with the industry, that they didn't think that the industry would want to be involved in prevention. And so they more or less excluded them. So how did that differ for you? And I know that was one of the distinguishing characteristics of your work in comparison to the other cities.
Well, we became a part of a matter of degree in the late 1990s. So our community already had a history of working in partnership with the hospitality industry at both the retailer and the wholesaler level. We did not involve any distributors, but at those two levels, since they lived and worked in our community, we thought it was important. I would say our greatest challenge was in the very beginning when we established the Responsible Hospitality Council. And my kudos go to Robin Mahoney, who at that time was the director of the Lincoln Council on Alcoholism and Drugs, who really said, no, we think is the best strategy going forth, because at that time it was very controversial within the prevention field to work collaboratively with the prevention industry or with the alcohol industry. And so we already had a rich history, and going into the matter of degree program, it was going to be the way we were going to do business, because it would be impossible at that point to exclude them. In fact, they were part of the conversation when we decided to apply and we completed the grant application. So they either let them in or we didn't participate.
Yeah, well, that was quite noble and obviously forward thinking for you. So now we're getting close to the end here. In retrospect, how do you see, how would you describe what seems to be a very integrated approach that began with the Responsible Hospitality Council, having all of the stakeholders. Now, we didn't talk about your city council liquor committee, which also played a role because you had dedication among the city council who were informed and aware. You engaged the elected officials and other key stakeholders to go out on a Saturday night till closing time to witness firsthand what was going on, and then to be strategic about the data collection and using that data for much more focused interventions with problematic businesses, and then changing policy based upon that. So overall, it seems that you had this incredibly integrated system, and naturally, every year you get a whole new wave of students who don't know the rules, they don't know the environment. How do you work to bring people on board, and how do you alleviate the frustration that people have that have made the changes, but then have to repeat the process over and over and over again?
Well, I think we could talk another 6, 7, 8 hours about that question alone. What occurs to me, and I've been away from it for a little while now, having retired pre-COVID, and also having changed my job responsibilities at the university over time. But I think when we were firing on all cylinders and really managing that integrated approach that you described, it is because we had people, staff people, dedicated to keeping that all moving. When we lost sight of that and just sort of rested on our laurels, so to speak, and sort of thought we've got the system pieces in place that were ongoing. The internal liquor committee you referenced earlier still is a viable entity. We still have management training. We've now added server education. We have some form of a responsible hospitality council, but it's much looser than it used to. We have last drink data, but a lot has happened to Cornhusker Place Detoxification Center, and there's been changes in the contract. So we have fewer contacts with intoxicated people and the data isn't as rich. So I think to make that all work, and what made it successful in Lincoln is when we had dedicated staff people who were working on a regular basis to ensure that that system was in place and making adjustments and changes on what the data was saying and what we were hearing from the multiple partners.
That's a good way to end, because what's happening now throughout the world, literally, is kind of related to this night mayor or this dedicated office like New York and DC. They've legislated and through the mayor's office, an office of nightlife or nightlife and culture, and it has staff. Some places have multiple staff, and they're all working to bring the stakeholders together. They're less focused on alcohol and more just kind of resolving conflicts and also developing a more vibrant social experience for people. But your point that you need a dedicated staff that ideally would be housed within some entity like the mayor's office or city council or city manager's office, or even the one person that was just hired in Sacramento is in the economic department. So they're housed in different places, but their function is still the same. How do you organize your stakeholders? How do you focus your efforts to be more specific to where the needs are? And so I think you laid the groundwork for, that kind of approach. And obviously it had an impact, but sustainability of any innovation is always the greatest challenge. Well, this has been a wonderful recap. It brings back so many memories of Lincoln and the wonderful people that I met, and and also the dedication of everybody there. And it was an amazing experience for me. I loved our relationship together. It was over 3 years, I think, that we worked together on this project. And like I said, it really laid a solid foundation. And I'm happy to hear that you're moving on to be a grandmother and to be more engaged as a volunteer in your community. But you really have to take credit for being a great innovator. And I'm sure cities throughout the world have learned from you. And obviously some of those pieces that you created continue. So thank you for this. And it was great to talk with you again.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to reminisce. You really pulled on some of my memory cells. So thank you.